But you know what? We've all got stuff to do. It's Sunday night. We've got to get ready to face the Monday, so we might as well get started. Yeah, all right, here we go. So we're looking at, obviously, we're looking at Tale of Two Cities, London and Brighton, and what you've got there is Brighton Pavilion. We will come to that in good time. So our first stop is going to be in London itself. So, first place we're going to go to is the Old Bailey. Now, the Old Bailey is the Central Criminal Court. I'm sure you know that. It's been the Old Bailey since 1902, and it has some of the most famous trials have taken place here. So, for instance, Geoffrey Archer, when he was, that's not Geoffrey Archer, that's Christine Keeler. The Perfumer affair, Stephen Ward, the osteopath, was tried here at the Old Bailey with the connection with Christine Keeler. Geoffrey Archer was tried here for his perjury over his relationship with Monica Coughlin. And also the Cray twins, famously played by Tom Hardy, both of them played by Tom Hardy. They were tried here as well. They tried to nobble the jury at the Old Bailey by threatening them with cyanide poisoning. But it didn't work, as you might imagine. They went away for a very long time. But what, you might be thinking, well, what's the connection here? Where are we going to go with this? The Old Bailey, famous trials, yes, all well and good. However, we're going to go to Brighton now and see if we can make a connection. So it's the 1st of October, 1837, and a man is rolling gently downhill in a wheelchair towards the Brighton seafront, which is what you see here in about the 19th century. And he falls out of his wheelchair just in front of, well, Waitrose, but it wasn't there at the time. Well, Waitrose is now. He falls out of his wheelchair and nobody goes to help him. Why not? Well, it comes down to this location. This is opposite the Old Bailey. This is back in London. This is St Sepulchre without Newgate, the church. It's diagonally opposite the Old Bailey. And they have something in the St Sepulchre without Newgate church called the Newgate Bell. And it's a bell that used to be rung before executions, because before the Old Bailey was where it was, it used to be the site of Newgate Prison. So here we're looking at a photo pre-1902. This is Newgate Prison. This here is the Viaduct Tavern. I hope you can see the arrow that I'm moving up and down. Let me know if you can't. This is the Viaduct Tavern. It's still there today. This is where the Old Bailey is, but this itself is Newgate Prison from 1188 up until around 1902. There's St Paul's just behind it. Newgate Prison, notoriously the site of executions, and the bell was rung at St Sepulchre just before each execution, and the night before the execution, the priest from St Sepulchre would go over to the condemned cells and he would read out this to those people. All you that in the condemned hold do lie, prepare you for tomorrow you will die. Watch all and pray for the hours drawing near, you before the Almighty must appear. Examine well yourselves, in time repent, that you may not to eternal flames be sent. And when St Sepulchre's bell tomorrow tolls, the Lord have mercy on your souls. Imagine what that must have felt like, sitting in a prison cell in one of these grim looking buildings, knowing that tomorrow you're going to be executed. And where did those executions take place? Well, not in the prison, at least not from 1783. They took place under the auspices of Jack Ketch, just outside. Now, Jack Ketch, you might be able to see, hopefully, it's in inverted commas, because Jack Ketch was the name of one of the earliest executioners back in the 14th century. And the name was used from then on for every official executioner. Jack Ketch was not the name of the person that we are talking about. His name was actually Jemmy Botting, and he was the person who carried out the executions outside the Old Bailey. He's the person that I was talking about, who was rolling down the hill in the wheelchair from Montpellier Road the corner of Western Road, and who, just outside Waitrose, fell out of his wheelchair and was left to die. He was the executioner at Newgate Prison, the first to be paid a salary. In fact, he was born in Brighton, lived in Brighton, died in Brighton. He used to commute to work, like a lot of Brighton people do. He used to go up to London to carry out his executions. He was incredibly unpopular in Brighton, hence why he was left to die. It is said that Brighton heaved a great sigh of relief when Jemmy Botting died, because they didn't have to any longer listen to his grim tales of the executions he carried out outside the Old Bailey. And in particular, this one, Jemmy Botting, the Brighton resident, the one who fell out the wheelchair, the executioner, was responsible for the execution of 5 of the Cato Street conspirators. Now you might be saying to yourself, Cato Street conspiracy? Not so sure I know that one very well. Cato Street conspiracy, 1820. It was a group of men who gathered together in a place called Cato Street, funnily enough, which is just off the Edgware Road, with the intention of killing the government. They intended to assassinate Lord Liverpool, who was the Prime Minister at the time, and all of his cabinet. Now, the reason they wanted to do that, we'll come to in a second, was particularly because of some incredibly poor behaviour by that government. But unfortunately for the Cato Street conspirators, the authorities had placed spies in amongst their group. And before they could carry out the plot, it was a bomb plot. In fact, they were going to blow up the government at a dinner party in Grosvenor Square. Before they could carry out that assassination, the police came and arrested them in their house on Cato Street, in the course of which a constable died, as did one of the conspirators. And Jemmy Botting, the executioner for Brighton, was involved in hanging the Cato Street conspirators. And more bizarrely, well, shockingly, this was the last public beheading as well. The 5 conspirators were hanged, outside the Old Bailey, as it is now. And then their heads were cut off publicly to demonstrate the government's disapproval of such behaviour. Now, of course, I would never advocate violence to solve political problems, but the government of the day were particularly egregiously problematic, because the reason for the Cato Street conspiracy was what had gone on in Manchester the year before. 1819, the Peterloo Massacre. Peterloo Massacre, in brief, a group of working people gathered together, the Chartists and some suffragists wanted the vote for women. They gathered together to say they want the vote. Remember 1819, most people don't have the vote, only people with money and land. And they gathered together in Manchester in what's now St. Peter's Square, which then was called St. Peter's Fields. And the local Salford and Manchester yeomanry, apparently drunk at the time, were ordered to charge, I should say, into the crowd on their horses, as you can see going on here. They swung about them wildly with their sabres against a crowd of peaceful, ordinary working people. They killed 18 of them and injured 600. This was on the orders of local magistrates. Now, if that were to happen today, and under the orders of perhaps local misguided magistrates, the government would no doubt have been horrified and did something about it. What did this government do as a result of the Peterloo Massacre? They brought in something called the 6 Acts, one of which, the result of which was to ban further gatherings of this kind, not to protect people, but just to stop protest. So that was the cause of the Cato Street conspiracy. Why was it called the Peterloo Massacre? Well, it was a reference to Waterloo. And this gentleman here, Sir Francis Burdett, he was a politician, an MP, and he wrote a pamphlet about the Peterloo Massacre, comparing it with Waterloo, and pointed out the horrific nature of what had gone on, blamed the government. And here's another example of what was going on at the time in 1819. He was put in prison for it. He was put in prison for writing a pamphlet which basically said it was wrong of the government to sanction killing of innocent people. That's what was going on in 1819. That's why the government was so unpopular, and that's why, in a way, Jemmy Botting was so unpopular as well for what he'd done. So Peterloo references Waterloo, the Battle of Waterloo, 1815, and our next connection is the Brighton train station, and that connects somehow. There is in back in the 1840s when it's first built. That connects somehow to Waterloo and the Duke of Wellington. Let me tell you how. So the Duke of Wellington, remember, 1815, Battle of Waterloo, triumphs over Napoleon, national hero. Doesn't remain a national hero for quite the rest of his life, because 1828 he's prime minister. Some of his policies very unpopular. We'll come to that shortly. However, when he sorry, we're going to go from the Old Bailey and we're going to cross over town to the Royal Hospital, because when the Duke of Wellington died, he was laid in state here in Chelsea in the Royal Hospital. Now, some of you may have looked at the Instagram and Facebook teasers I did, and I promised you a Chelsea connection. So here it is. Here's the Chelsea connection, because the Royal Hospital is the home of the Chelsea pensioners. And Chelsea Football Club used to have as its badge the Chelsea pensioners. In fact, they used to be called the pensioners, was their nickname. Now, the Royal Hospital was set up as a home for retired servicemen. It's not a hospital in the sense that we might think of today. It is a place for hospitality, if you like. And still today, 400 or so veteran military men and women now live in this property. You can visit it under normal circumstances. Here it is, near River. Battersea Power Station is just there. At the moment, you can't visit because of the COVID situation and the inhabitants being elderly and more frail, but it is a very interesting visit. Now, why is it here? There it is when it was first built in the 17th century, 1680s, under the auspices of Charles II, the Merry Monarch. He arranged for it to be built, financed it, got Christopher Wren in, the architect of St. Paul's, got him in to build it. But the real reason that it was created, and has a lovely statue of Charles there, looking very grand, the real reason it was created is this lady here, Nell Gwyn. Now, we've all heard, I'm sure, Nell Gwyn, orange selling and mistress of Charles II. But, you know, I think we really need to give Nell Gwyn a bit of credit. She was a very special person, because born in relative poverty, really. She was born in a bawdy house, as they called it in those days. We might call it a brothel, perhaps, these days. She was brought up in a very difficult circumstances, and she really made the most of her charm, but also her wit. Samuel Pepys, the great diarist of the 17th century, referred to her as Pretty Witty Nell, because she was bright and clever as well. And she made sure that that hospital got built mainly because of her father. Her father had been a soldier, a retired soldier, and had nothing to go on, nothing to survive on when he stopped being part of the military. And she pressured Charles into creating the Royal Hospital. So it's largely because of Nell that it's there. Now, Nell really made the most of her position as a royal mistress. We're going to nip up from the Royal Hospital up the road into Pall Mall, because that is where Nell Gwyn's house is. Still there today. And it's not just a house that she lived in. Charles II gave it to her, but she also made sure she got the freehold of the house. The land that the house is on belonged to her. And to this day, on that side of Pall Mall, it's the only house that isn't part of the Crown Estate. That's how smart Nell Gwyn was. She was also funny. She referred to Charles II, her lover, as Charles III, because she'd already had affairs with two previous noble Charleses. So he was Charles III as far as she was concerned. She was also quite clever. At this time, remember, we're talking about the 1670s, 1680s. It was in your best interest to be Protestant rather than Catholic. There was a lot of negativity towards Catholicism for reasons we won't go into much detail. Now, Nell wasn't Charles II's only mistress. He had quite a few, hence the Merry Monarch. One of them was a French lady, Comtesse de Kerouaille, and her religion was Catholic. She was incredibly unpopular with the London crowds. She also had a distinctive horse and carriage. Now, one day, Nell and Charles borrowed the Comtesse de Querouaille's carriage to trot across London. And the carriage was spotted by the London mob, who proceeded to surround it and jeer, shout, throw fruit the way they might have done and shake the carriage. Whereupon Nell stuck her head out the window and said, "Be peaceful, good people, for I am the Protestant whore," which they all cheered at and sent her on her way happily. So that was pretty witty. Now, what's the connection to Brighton railway station? We're still not quite there, are we? So it's the Duke of Wellington. Duke of Wellington dies. He's laid in state here at the Royal Hospital when he dies in 1852. So that's there only because of Nell Gwynn. He's in the dining hall here. This currently exists as a recent picture. There's an image of it from its time. There was a grand procession in this amazing bronze car, which you can still see today. It's at the Stratfield Say in Hampshire, the family seat of the Wellingtons. And it was an incredible event. They took him in procession across London from Chelsea Royal Hospital to Horse Guards, which is Horse Guards Parade as it is today. And then the next day from Horse Guards to St. Paul's. About 1.5 million people lined the streets. You can still see today in St. Paul's this very grand memorial. Here's Wellington on his horse, Copenhagen at the top. Here's an effigy of Wellington down below. It took an enormous amount of time to finish this. It was 54 years to finish this particular memorial here. And the funeral itself was just as grand. 1.5 million people lined the streets, 10,000 people in the procession. That bronze carriage that I mentioned, 27 feet long. Bit of comedy on the day when the wheels broke down, they couldn't get the mechanism to work. But when he died, he was talked about as the last great Englishman. That's what Alfred Lord Tennyson, the poet laureate at the time, called him, the last great Englishman. And the last great Englishman was named Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington. And Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, died at Brighton railway station. Now, I know there's a few people on here today will be going, hang on a minute, that's not right. The Duke of Wellington died at his family home in Walmer Castle. Yes, but an Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, did die at Brighton railway station, and that was his son, Arthur Wellesley, the second Duke of Wellington. I admit it's a slightly tenuous link, but it definitely was a Duke of Wellington. He definitely did die at Brighton railway station. And let's face it, all the Dukes of Wellington lived here. This is Apsley House, right on Hyde Park Corner, as we call it. Even today, the modern Dukes of Wellington have the penthouse apartment upstairs here, although you can visit the downstairs area. It has some really interesting art collection. But the Wellingtons still live there. That Duke of Wellington did. The first Duke of Wellington did. The first Duke of Wellington lived in that house, Apsley House. Here it is on a map. There's what we call Hyde Park Corner. Technically, it's Duke of Wellington Place. It has on it the Wellington Arch. There it is. Opposite the Duke of Wellington's house, there's a statue of him on a horse, which was there when he was living there. It's no wonder, is it, that he had a reputation for a certain arrogance, the Duke of Wellington. And you'll have heard of him referred to as the Iron Duke. Well, the reason he was called the Iron Duke was because he put up iron shutters over the glass windows of Apsley House so that they didn't keep getting smashed by the mob, because his policies were so unpopular. He was a very reactionary prime minister, was Duke of Wellington. So that's where the Iron Duke comes from. So now, the reason we're going to, or we're going from Apsley House to our next link to Brighton, and we're going just a few yards down the road into Belgrave Square. So Belgravia is just down the road from Apsley House. Belgravia as an area is a very exclusive and expensive part of London. It has a connection with Wellington, not just nearby, but also there was a recent TV series called Belgravia, which was set in the period leading up to the Battle of Waterloo, written by Julian Fellowes, who also wrote Downton Abbey. And here is Belgrave Square, And here is one of those very grand houses on Belgrave Square, currently the Argentinian embassy. But it's also, for you Downton Abbey fans, this is Lady Rosamond's house from Downton Abbey, right there on Belgrave Square. Oops, there she is, Samantha Bond. Now, the reason that Belgrave Square exists is the Duke of Devonshire's property development, but the reason it looks the way it does is because of this chap, Thomas Cubitt. Here is a statue of him. It's down the road in Pimlico, not quite Belgrave Square, but in that area. And you can see behind him more of that same grand stucco effect. Thomas Cubitt was an engineer, builder, designer, somebody who is responsible for huge swathes of the London that we now know today. Pimlico wouldn't have existed without Thomas Cubitt working out how to take landfill from St Catherine Dock over on the Tower City side, bringing it to Pimlico and dumping it there to make it a place that you could build on instead of the marsh that it was. He built so much around London that it's almost difficult to find places that aren't connected to him. But the connection to Brighton is this house here, Downshire House, right there on Belgrave Square. This was the house of a gentleman called Thomas Kemp. And Thomas Kemp was responsible for Kemp Town, a part of Brighton. He developed that area, had it developed, and his developer builder was, there's Thomas Kemp, there's Thomas Cubitt, was in fact Thomas Cubitt. Thomas Cubitt, again, designed and ensured the building of these areas. Sussex Square, Kempton was where Cubitt himself lived. This is where Thomas Kemp himself lived, Lewis Crescent in Kemp Town. Now, Cubitt, you really have to realize just what an effect he had. So, for instance, Tavistock Square, right up there in Bloomsbury. Tavistock Square was laid out by Thomas Cubitt. Yet another part of town that wouldn't be the same without him. Now, he didn't build this building. This is a building by Lutyens from the 20s. But he did build a house on this site for a certain Charles Dickens. This house here, Tavistock House, built for Dickens by Cubitt. Cubitt was renowned for providing soundproof studies, both for Dickens, Thackeray and Carlyle. Now, Dickens, Charles Dickens, 19th century novelist, lived here right on this site. And his Brighton connection, yeah, we're going back to Brighton, because at the time of living here, he wrote Hard Times, Little Dorrit. Funnily enough, for our presentation today, he also wrote A Tale of Two Cities, which is what I called this. But he also wrote large parts of Dombey and Son here. But he finished most of Dombey and Son here in the Holiday Inn in Brighton. Clearly not that building that is the kind of modern Holiday Inn. Oops. There was a building called the Bedford Hotel on the site of the current Holiday Inn. This blue plaque is there in the Holiday Inn itself. And Dickens wrote Dombey and Son mostly in Brighton. We're going to come back to the Dickens link later on. Now, so we've got to Brighton with Thomas Cubitt. We're going to go back to London with Thomas Cubitt and get a connection to our next Brighton link from him. Now, Thomas Cubitt was very popular with the royals. He's very good friends with Queen Victoria and Albert. And he built Osborne House. Those of you familiar with the Isle of Wight might know. He built Osborne House for Queen Victoria. And he was asked to improve Buckingham Palace. And one of the things he did was to get rid of the Marble Arch. You might have thought that the Marble Arch in London has always been at the end of Park Lane. You'd be wrong. It used to stand in front of Buckingham Palace. Cubitt was responsible for moving it. This is what the original design of it looked like. And it was originally designed by this chap, John Nash, which is our next Brighton connection. John Nash is responsible for huge swathes of London, Regent's Park, Regent Street, all sorts of areas around the Mall, Carlton House Terrace, and these wonderful houses that still exist around Regent's Park. But in Brighton, he's responsible for this amazing confection. The Brighton Pavilion is a real combination of what they used to call Orientalism, all kinds of Indian style, Mughal style minarets and weirdness. It has been described as a crazed masterpiece of bad art. And it was built by John Nash for George IV. the king at the time, who was the regent mentioned in Regent's Park and Regent Street. Before he was king, he was regent for his father, George III, who was officially declared insane in 1811. Now, George IV was not a nice man. He married Caroline of Brunswick, and she didn't like him, and he hated her, to the extent that at his coronation in 1820, this is in Westminster Abbey, as all monarchs have been crowned since 1066, he banned her, Caroline, he banned her from his coronation, and to the extent that he actually had professional bouncers, boxers, parked at each of the entrances to Westminster Abbey. And effectively, when she came along, tried to get in, they would say to her, "Your name's not on the list, you're not coming in." And that's how the king treated his queen. Not a nice man. However, he had been married before. He had an illegal secret marriage to this lady, Maria Fitzherbert, who was actually the love of his life and is the other connection to Brighton, because they spent their happiest times together, George IV and Maria Fitzherbert. This is where she lived, 55 Old Steine in Brighton. She's buried at St John's, Kemp Town. And he married her illegally. He wasn't allowed to. He had to pretend that he wasn't married to her. And in the end, he had to disown her for the purposes of being king. But when he died, he changed his will, partly in her favour. He had asked, and it happened that when he was buried in St George's Chapel, he's buried with a miniature portrait of Maria Fitzherbert in his coffin. She was the love of his life. Who knows? You'll know the story, I guess, that the Taj Mahal was built by Shah Jahan in the 17th century for the love of his life, Mumtaz Mahal. Maybe, just maybe, that's why the Brighton Pavilion looks the way it does. Now, moving on from John Nash, or back to John Nash, I should say, one of the few things left of all the work that Nash did is this beautiful church made of Bath stone, All Souls Church in Portland Place. And there's a statue of Nash. You can go and look him directly in the face. It's just here behind that pillar. And the place is right next to the BBC. It's known as the BBC Church. This is Broadcasting House. We're not going to talk about the BBC. We're going to talk about this statue here by a chap called Eric Gill. And it's Prospero and Ariel. Ariel, god of the air, a symbol of broadcasting. This is Eric Gill, the chap who designed it, designed and created that statue. He's done many around London, on Transport House, for instance, on Broadway. And he lived, or was born, I should say, here in Brighton, in this very nondescript looking terrace with a little plaque on the wall. He is the inventor of a font. If you go to a computer and look at your list of fonts, you'll find a font called Gill Sans and variations on that theme. And Eric Gill invented it, and it was used in all these ways you can see here. But he was not a nice man, Eric Gill. He was a, frankly, sexual pervert. He had affairs with his various friends. He had affairs with his sisters. He had incest with his daughters and sex with his dog. He's not a nice man. We're going to move on to somebody who is a far more wholesome and interesting story, right next to John Nash. Can you see that little green plaque just there? There's John Nash outside All Souls. There's the green plaque. It's on a hotel called the Langham Hotel. There's the green plaque up close, and it says Oscar Wilde, Arthur Conan Doyle dined here, that led to the Sign of Four and the picture of Dorian Gray. Sign of Four, Sherlock Holmes story, picture of Dorian Gray, the only novel that Oscar Wilde wrote. Here they are, Conan Doyle and Oscar Wilde. We're going to focus on Oscar Wilde because his Brighton connection is just here. The birthplace of a chap called Aubrey Beardsley, right there in Brighton. And Aubrey Beardsley was a fascinating character, an artist who has affected a great deal of graphic designers and artists over the years, particularly in the 60s and 70s. He was a dandy, as you can see, you know, the gloves, the stick, the bow tie, the buttonhole. This is somebody who took great care of the way he looked and presented himself. He was very much in competition with Oscar Wilde. They weren't great friends, although they worked together. And he was very popular, as I said, later in the 60s and 70s with some of our great artists. And John Lennon was a particular fan of Aubrey Beardsley. Why am I showing you Sergeant Pepper? Well, just up there in the corner, there he is. Let's have a little closer look. There is Aubrey Beardsley himself on the Sergeant Pepper cover. Now, he had a particular style, did Beardsley, a very distinctive style, all of his own, very exotic, very clean and clear and defined. He illustrated plays, he illustrated books. This is a self-portrait here. He became renowned to some extent for his slightly naughty and erotic drawings. This is from Lysistrata, a Greek play, with what starts off looking like a vase, but clearly isn't after you look at it for a second or two. Now, because of his particular style, he affected these kinds of artwork. So his Procol Harum, an album from the late 60s, even the Beatles, again, affected. Now, don't take my word for it. This is from the Tate Britain exhibition, so a Tate Modern exhibition on Aubrey Beardsley. And they included this album cover as an example of his influence. Now, I said I'd give you a Colin Firth reference. Now, the most famous play, perhaps most famous work of Oscar Wilde's, is The Importance of Being Earnest, made into this film later on with Colin Firth. But he also did a tragedy. He was more famous for his comedies, but he did a tragedy called Salome, which is the story from the Bible of Salome, who wants the head of John the Baptist on a plate. And this was illustrated by Aubrey Beardsley. Here it is, looking pretty gruesome, I think it's fair to say. Now, 1895, Oscar Wilde and Aubrey Beardsley are both at the peak of their powers. Beardsley is involved in this book. He's involved in creating it. He illustrates it on the outside, sometimes on the inside. It's a literary quarterly with essays and stories, etc. The Yellow Book. Now, it was quite provocative to choose the colour yellow, because in the late 19th century, French erotic novels were, the delicate eyes of Victorian ladies were protected from seeing the covers of French erotic novels by having them wrapped in yellow paper. That was a tradition. So calling it the Yellow Book and making it yellow was a nod in that direction. But this was also Beardsley's downfall, sadly. Now, you'll know the story of Oscar Wilde, I'm sure, but just to recap, Oscar Wilde was in a same-sex relationship with the son of the Marquis of Queensberry, a gentleman called Lord Alfred Douglas, known as Bosie, nicknamed Bosie. And when the Marquis of Queensberry discovered this, he set out to get Oscar Wilde, and over a long period of toing and froing, he eventually did get him. And Wilde was arrested for indecency, in other words, loving another man, which is, it's a shocking thing to us to think that would be arrestable now, but it was. And he was arrested here at the Cadogan Hotel. And that was Wilde's downfall, but it was also Beardsley's downfall, because when he was arrested, Wilde was seen by the London mob, who had heard about the arrest, to be carrying a copy of The Yellow Book. And as a result of that, the publishers, I don't know if you can see just here, it says John Lane, publishers on Vigo Street, just off Regent Street, the publishers' building was stormed by the mob, the windows were smashed, and John Lane had to sack Beardsley and discontinue the Yellow Book because of the Wilde arrest. The supreme irony, though, is Wilde wasn't carrying a copy of the Yellow Book, he was carrying a French erotic novel wrapped in yellow paper. So we have to finish by going back to Brighton and talking about it, as obviously Brighton has a great reputation as an LGBTQ plus innovator. This is the AIDS Memorial in Brighton, and I want to finish by connecting Wilde up with what should be an LGBTQ icon. No, not Bosie, Lord Alfred Douglas, although he did finish his days in Brighton, but it's a lady connected to this lady here. Harriet Beauclerk, Duchess of St Albans, lived in this building here, which is now a chip shop. And she married, first of all, Thomas Coutts, as in the bank, the Queen's Bank, Coutts, and became the richest woman in Europe. When she died, she was living here at the Mayfair Hotel, although she was living in a house on this site, not the actual Mayfair Hotel. And she gave her fortune to effectively a stepdaughter, Angela Burdett Coutts. So recap that, it's a little complex. Harriet Beauclerk, Duchess of St Albans, lived in Brighton, married the banker Coutts, then later on married the Duke of St Albans, left all her money to Angela Burdett Coutts. And this lady is the lady that I think should be, if she's not already, an LGBTQ icon for two reasons. First of all, she spent 52 years in an open same-sex relationship in the late 19th century, which is unheard of. She is responsible for all sorts of philanthropic goings on. So this is St Luke's Church over in Westminster. This is the Burdett Coutts Primary School attached to the church. And she is the sole originator of the NSPCC. It wouldn't exist without Angela Burdett Coutts. She gave away something in the region of £3 million, which is the equivalent of about probably 30 million today. She's also responsible for this. This is the Burdett Coutts Memorial. And this is the other reason why I think she ought to be considered an LGBTQ icon, because that memorial is in the grounds of St Pancras Old Church. It's right near St Pancras Station. And when St Pancras Station, when the railway was being created, they had to close down huge chunks of the churchyard of St Pancras Old Church. And they had to relocate lots and lots of the graves. The bodies were interred elsewhere, unmarked, and the gravestones were moved. Coincidentally, just as an aside, it was Thomas Hardy, the 19th century novelist, Tesla d'Urbervilles, Far from the Madding Crowd, etc., who was the architect who had oversight of this here. So it's now known as the Hardy Tree in St Pancras Old Church. You can still see it today. But Burdett Coutts felt that wasn't right. So she created that memorial that we just saw there to commemorate, to memorialize those people whose graves were gone. That in itself is a good thing. However, one of the people on that memorial was this person, a famous 17th century diplomat, a spy, and a crossdresser. Somebody whose pronouns we would now refer to as their, and their life was lived to start with as the Chevalier d'Eon in France, a cavalier, a male military person. And the second half of their life lived as the Mademoiselle d'Eon. It is a fascinating story. We haven't got time for the full story, but just to think that Angela Burdett Coutts ensured that this person was commemorated on that memorial makes her important. Finally, she's going to link everything back together, because Burdett Coutts worked with Charles Dickens on this Urania cottage. It looks like this nowadays. It's over in Shepherd's Bush, but at the time it was a home for prostitutes. Worked with Charles Dickens on that. Charles Dickens dedicated Martin Chuzzlewit to Angela Burdett Coutts. In later life, after the death of her partner, her longtime partner Hannah, she proposed to the Duke of Wellington. For whatever reasons, we'll never really know. He turned her down, probably best for both of them. Her father, we just mentioned earlier on, Francis Burdett, the gentleman who was imprisoned for writing that pamphlet about the Peterloo massacre. That was her father. And she's connected to Nell Gwynn as well, right back to the beginning. How could that possibly be? Well, Harriet Mellon, who gave her all her money, married the Duke of St Albans. And this goes back to Pretty Witty Nell, because Nell Gwynn had a child with Charles II. Nell and Charles were in the same house. Charles was playing with the child. Charles also, it was called. And Nell said to the child, "Come here, you little bastard." Charles said, "You can't talk about our son like that." She said, "My lord, what else should I call him? He has no title." Clever girl. On the spot, Charles declared that he was the Duke of St Albans, Charles Beauclerk, and he was the first Duke of St Albans. And Harriet Mellon, the benefactor of Angela Burdett Coutts, married the 9th Duke of St Albans, a direct descendant, therefore, of Nell Gwynn. So that's it. We've been from the Old Bailey over to the Royal Hospital. We've gone from the Royal Hospital to Apsley House. Apsley House has taken us to Belgrave Square, Belgrave Square to Tavistock Square, and finally, All Souls Church led us to Cadogan Place. And Burdett Coutts lived at the Mayfair Hotel. That's it. Thank you for your support, everyone. I hope you have enjoyed it, found it useful, interesting, whatever it might be. And if you've got any questions, I will be delighted to take them now. But if not, feel free to get on with your Sunday evening. But thank you for being here. Thanks for the money, which will go to those charities.